Put the Narcan down. Narcan is for respiratory depression only. You think I'm kidding with you? I'm not kidding with you. I'm going to cover some of the fine details of how EMS misuses Narcan and some of the applications and science behind why it works or why it doesn't work. Stay tuned. So when we're talking about Narcan, we're usually talking about respiratory depression secondary to opiate overdose. However, EMS tends to misuse it, and so do other professions as well. Here are some examples of how Narcan gets misused. More frequently, it occurs with police officers who, in their defense, don't really know better. They're not trained medical professionals in this respect, but they do it for crystal meth overdoses. They view an asthma attack as, oh, well, this must be an overdose, let's do Narcan. And other situations where Narcan is just blatantly really not called for. So we're going to cover some of those situations. We're going to bust down some dogma with some science. And specifically how it applies to EMS providers, we're going to talk about Narcan in cardiac arrest. Now, you may say, well, Dominic, you've already covered this subject before. Especially if you're a long-time listener to the podcast, you remember I did an episode on Narcan way back when it was just audio only. But just this year, I had a cardiac arrest where I was offered Narcan for cardiac arrest, even though it was a known overdose, and I had to politely turn it down. So this myth is still alive and well. And it's not just EMS providers. I had a witnessed arrest of an athlete in an athletic situation with a known heart condition. And I was asked at the hospital, well, did you give him some Narcan? So we're going to cover some of that, and we're going to discuss why it works or why it doesn't work. So some of the myths that are perpetuated is, you have to treat the underlying causes, you have to treat the H's and T's, or that somehow opioids cause myocardial depression. And we're going to approach them in different ways. So let's start off with talking about treating the underlying cause. So the way that a typical progression works is you have central nervous system depression from your opiates, which leads to respiratory depression, which then leads to respiratory arrest, and then ultimately progressing to cardiac arrest. And that's typically how your opiate overdoses progress to cardiac arrest. However, what if you take out the respiratory component of it? What if you have an intubated patient and you give them huge doses of, say, fentanyl or morphine? If you take out the respiratory component, you have central nervous system depression, but it does not lead to cardiac arrest, because if they don't have respiratory depression and respiratory arrest, you don't get the cardiac arrest. So when we're treating the underlying cause, we're talking about bradypnea, hypoventilation, hypoxia, hypercapnia, and ultimately respiratory arrest, which we ultimately treat with a BVM, which is part of your standard BLS CPR course of care. Now, there's also the H's and T's. And the H's and T's that we're talking about, in particular with Narcan or opioid-related overdoses, you're talking about your typical hypoxia as a direct cause of that arrest, not the toxic cause. The toxins cause the respiratory depression and arrest. So, hyponaloxonemia is not a reversible cause. It's not one of the H's and T's. In fact, it's not even technically a word. But people would still insist on following the H's and T's. And now, a more difficult claim to debunk is the myth of myocardial depression and opioids. That opioids cause myocardial depression, and the reversal of opioids may lead to restoration of cardiac function. This myth is going to take a little bit more time and effort to debunk. So let's dive right into it. So here's a study where naloxone was given to some rats in asphyxia. Essentially what they did is they took some rats, they intubated them. I'm not entirely sure how you intubate a rat. I imagine you have to use a very small BT tube. But so anyways, they intubated some rats, and they clamped off the ET tube until they died, and then they tried to take a look and saw what resuscitation was better. So when they took a look at the data, the results were as follows. They had 28 rats that were asphyxiated. The dose of Narcan was 1 milligram per kilogram. So to put that in human perspective, for someone my size, you'd probably have about 100 milligrams or 50 prefills of Narcan that you're giving. And what was the result? Well, the coronary perfusion pressure in the naloxone group did not reach statistical significance. So here's a graph of what the coronary perfusion pressure looked like. At 10 minutes, there was an increase, and I'm not sure if that was just an aberrant data set. But overall, when they looked at the statistical significance, there was no difference between the saline group and the Narcan group as compared with the actual increases in coronary perfusion pressure with epinephrine. Now, I'm not sure that I would hang my hat on making my product as good as epinephrine, given that the first CritMedic Live episode, we talked about the study that came out, Paramedic 2, that really showed that epinephrine didn't really improve things in cardiac arrest. So here's another study. Use of naloxone during cardiac arrest, a potential adjunct for EMD. So when they took a look at this data, the results were the naloxone dose was 5 milligrams per kilogram. So to put that in perspective, someone my size, you're talking about 500 milligrams of naloxone, which would be about 250 prefills of 2 milligrams each, which I don't think even police officers carry that much. And when they looked at the data, when they had a dose of less than 1 milligram per kilogram, there was no effect. So we conclude that naloxone has no hemodynamic effect during CPR and does not facilitate defibrillation, and that naloxone may be of benefit in the management of EMD following countershock, but overall had no hemodynamic impacts. So let's take a look at another study. High dose naloxone does not improve cerebral or myocardial blood flow during cardiopulmonary resuscitation in pigs. So we looked at rats. I don't remember what the previous one was. I think it might have been dogs. This one is in pigs. The results were 10 milligrams per kilogram. So someone my size, that would be a dose of 1,000 milligrams, which would be about 500 2 milligram prefills. The myocardial perfusion pressure and blood flow, there was no effect. Cerebral blood flow, no effect. So this might be the best counter-argument to the entire idea of naloxone in cardiac arrest. Because we find out actually that opioids, both endogenous, meaning internal to our own systems, and exogenous, have some cardioprotective properties. In fact, what they say is, quote, impressive evidence from experiments conducted in various in vitro and in vivo animal and human studies has demonstrated significant opioid-mediated protection against myocardial ischemic reperfusion injury. This effect was not observed in patients who had received the nonspecific opioid receptor antagonist naloxone. So, when you give Narcan, you're actually taking away the myocardial protection against reperfusion injury, especially in the context of cardiac arrest. So, don't give it, it can't hurt. Well, actually, according to this, it might. But so this is all just beating around the bush. We're looking at animal proxies and some other surrogate endpoints that don't really mean anything. Let's take a look at the human data. So in this one human study, naloxone and cardiac arrest with suspected overdoses, most people find this study fairly quickly when they take a look on the internet. And when you take a look at the conclusion, it says, we recommend its administration with any suspicion of opioid use. Wait a second. Did I just argue in favor of Narcan? Could this be the definitive proof in favor of Narcan? Well, not so fast. So what you saw was the article abstract, which gives you just an overview and some conclusions. However, when you actually break down into the study, and you really have to read the studies and not just the overall abstract, the devil in the details really comes out. Here is some of the positive proof. So they looked at these overdoses and they tried to take a look and see if there was any EKG change at all at any time in the patients that got Narcan. And if there was any change, regardless of if it's from PA to asystole or asystole to VF or whatever, that change must be a good thing, and at any time that Narcan was given, it must have been the Narcan that caused it. So here's 2 data points. I think they only had about 16 patients that they actually looked at that got Narcan. So a 23-year-old male was in asystole, received epi, atropine over 16 minutes, remained in asystole, received Narcan 2 milligrams dextrose, which doesn't really have a lot of benefit in rest either, epinephrine, atropine, sodium bicarb over 7 minutes. They converted to pulseless ventricular tachycardia 7 minutes after they got the Narcan. So clearly, it must have been the Narcan and not any of the other drugs that they gave that made the difference. And did we save them? Well, no, they were also pronounced in the ED. Well, how about this one? A 66-year-old male. PEA went to pulseless VTAC 10 minutes after Narcan. Received epi 2 times atropine over 10 minutes, remained in PEA, received Narcan 2 milligrams, epinephrine, sodium bicarb over the next 6 minutes, and then converted to pulseless ventricular tachycardia. And we didn't save them either because they also died. But wait, Dominic, maybe you're picking and choosing your data sets. Let's take a look at maybe a different set. Maybe that'll paint a picture. All right, let's take a look at this one. 24-year-old female, PEA unknown rate. Patient received epi, converted to asystole. Over the next 9 minutes, received epi, atropine, and converted into PEA. Patient received 1 milligram of Narcan, and they went back into asystole. But hey, that's a change. That must be a good thing. We saved. Well, no, we didn't save them either. What about this one? The 43-year-old female found in asystole, over 22 minutes, received epi times 3, atropine, thiamine, 100 milligrams. Wow, that's old school right there. Converted to PEA. Over the next 3 minutes, patient received epi, 75 grams of dextrose, and then they received Narcan, 10 milligrams, epi, and then 50 MEQs of bicarb. 8 minutes later, they went back into asystole. Well, we don't know what happened to this one, but hey, let's include in the data set of evidence here. But, all right, we'll do one more. So we've had asystole goes to an accelerated junctional rhythm 1 minute after Narcan. Ooh, look at that. That's proof positive that it works. I mean, never mind that you also gave epi and atropine, and also followed the Narcan immediately by epinephrine, and also they died. But hey, there was 1 minute, and never mind the epi in there. There was a Narcan that caused a change, and therefore it's positive. In fact, all the studies, all the examples that they give here, they all end up, dying. The only one that actually survived, they gave Narcan to, and I guess 1 minute later they had ROSC, and they ended up surviving and being discharged in the hospital after 2 days. So overall, this entire Sable study can be best summarized as a collection of anecdotes, most of which aren't really supportive. At least when paramedics tell anecdotes, they say, hey, I had this one patient, I gave epinephrine and Narcan to them, and they woke up and shook my hand and thanked me. This is, we gave Narcan and they still died. Cool story, bro. So I would rehash it and go on and on about it, but I've already covered all the data set in my podcast episode 14, when Narcan. So if you want to look at all the data that they had in that and can't afford to buy the full study, you can go right to my podcast and you'll see the data that they talked about in all these examples that I just gave. So there's another study. So out-of-hospital treatment of opioid overdoses in an urban setting. So this looked at 726 patients, of which they had 2 who were in cardiac arrest. And what did they find? Of the patients in full arrest, 2 had ROSC, but none of them survived. So that seems to bust the myth that this actually provides any benefit. So let's go over the ACLS guidelines. We have to go back in time to 2010. Things were a little bit more simple with the guidelines back then. So the ACLS Guidelines specifically said, there are no data to support the use of specific antidotes in the setting of cardiac arrest due to opioid overdose. Resuscitation from cardiac arrest should follow standard BLS and ACLS algorithms. So move forward to 2015. It's similar, but it's a little bit more complicated. So it says patients with opioid-associated cardiac arrest are managed in accordance with standard ACLS practices. But here's where it gets a little bit more complicated. It also says it may be reasonable to administer IM or IN naloxone based on the possibility that the patient is in respiratory arrest, not cardiac arrest. And what that means is that a lot of these patients that we encounter aren't actually in cardiac arrest. They may have a what we consider a PEA rhythm, but they're not actually fully in cardiac arrest. Laypersons especially, and even EMS and physicians are notoriously poor at palpating pulses, especially in the very hemodynamically compromised patients. So these patients might not actually be in cardiac arrest. They just are very hypotensive. In fact, a lot of our overall arrests, I'm convinced, aren't all necessarily PEA without any output. I think it might be what's called a pseudo-PEA. But going back to the point, it says it's reasonable to administer Narcan on the possibility that the patient is in respiratory arrest, not cardiac arrest. So this only works in patients who are in respiratory arrest. In cardiac arrest, Narcan has no application. So I think based on a review of all that evidence, we can probably say the myth of Narcan in cardiac arrest is busted. So hopefully that covers the topic of cardiac arrest and Narcan. Over the next month, we're going to be covering some of the cardiac rhythms and cardiac issues. In fact, we're going to do a cardiac academy. February is the heart month for the AHA, so I think that's probably as good a time as any. Sorry for the weird time of this podcast in the middle of the day. It's a bit of a change of pace. I'm going to say I'm exploring different time frames, but really the truth was I was just too exhausted last night to do the podcast at my usual time. So hopefully this is of interest to you. Stay tuned for the next episode. We're going to be covering Cardiac Academy, going over the A's, B's, and C's of everything you want to know about cardiac rhythms. We're going to cover it all. Until next time, keep thinking differently.